Blessings, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. And it's been a while since I've podcasted, but um, we're in the midst of Lent, and things have been busy with that. And so I wanted to do. So this is something that sort of came up during Lent. They gave me the idea to do this podcast about saints that have reached through the ages, Orthodox saints and specifically how they've affected my life. And there's three. Well, one is this is maybe some people could comment in the comment section whether or not Father Seraphim Rose is a saint. I guess, as a convert and fairly new, I'm not totally familiar with this process. But I guess in a certain, I guess you call it jurisdiction and orthodoxy, he has been declared a saint. So uh, I guess I shouldn't refer to him as a saint. And then, so I wanted to talk about Father Seraphim Rose, the Passion Bearers, the the Romanov martyrs of Russia, and also the three Optina martyrs. So I'm going to share my screen right now. Okay. It seems like everything in my life, a lot of things kind of started here. For people that don't know, this is the Castro district of San Francisco. I don't know a lot about the history of the area. It's not that important because I'd be taking a detour. I think what I'd known at one time it was sort of a working class Italian Irish neighborhood in San Francisco. In the 1970s, specifically, it became the center of the gay rights movement because it's very near the Haight-Ashbury. So, San Francisco is interesting for people that never been here. It's famous for all the hills, and it seems to be like these sort of valleys, little valleys that the hills form. There's neighborhoods. So in this area, you have the Castro district, and then sort of over another hill, you get into the Haight-Ashbury, and the Haight-Ashbury became famous in the 1960s, specifically 1967, when the hippies sort of declared that the summer of love. And, San Francisco specifically became sort of a haven for, well, I wrote about this in my book. San Francisco has a real interesting history, going back to the Barbary Coast and the gold rush. It was always sort of a mecca for adventurers, for the unconventional. Let me think. I mean, it's the furthest, excluding Alaska, it is the furthest west you can go in the continental United States, and Hawaii, of course. So excluding Hawaii and Alaska, so it was sort of the end point of the westward expansion of the United States. So sort of the last place you could go. So it just became a haven for people who, um, a lot of times it didn't fit the mold or were very, like I said, adventurous. And that reputation, I think, held fast for a long time. And in the 60s, it very much became a part of popular culture in terms of young people who were experimental and revolutionary, especially in terms of art and culture and sexuality. And San Francisco became a real focal point for that. Then, so the gay rights movement in the Castro very much grew out of the counterculture and the sexual revolution of the 1960s, which was taking place in the Haight-Ashbury. I think I have a yeah. There's the famous intersection of Haight and Ashbury, but sticking with the Castro district for a little bit longer. So this neighborhood, because you have to remember, let's say in the 70s and the 80s and into the 90s, people did not network online. That's become so a part of our culture nowadays that people have a hard time thinking about what life was like without it, like trying to think of what society was like before electricity. Well, people did live and function and survive. So, before of all this online networking, if you were a young man and you thought you were gay, you had to go to a place physically, geographically, where there were other gay men in order to meet them and be with them. So, I mean, I was certainly part of that cohort. I came out in 1988, which was the middle of the AIDS epidemic. That's another story. So, I mean, I didn't have far to go. I was born and raised just right outside of San Francisco, just a hop, skip, and a jump away. And so I just, drove down to San Francisco and came out. And whereas this great migration of gay men to San Francisco, especially in the 70s, it, came from all over the United States, the world as well. But I mean, when I was in the Castro, I met men from everywhere, the Midwest, the South, everywhere. They all went there for various reasons. A lot of times it was because they had felt alone or persecuted in their hometown, and they wanted to go somewhere where they would feel more free. So this is where I was primarily in the 1990s, and also in the Haight-Ashbury, which was very, whoops, getting ahead of myself, in the Haight-Ashbury, which is very close, walking distance if you really want to take a hike over the hills. I did it several times. I grew up in the 80s when there was a big sort of revival of interest in the 1960s. And it was very attractive to me that era. And a lot of people, a lot of Gen Xers, were really drawn to that. The 80s, I think part of it, I think every sort of 20 years, you see this sort of nostalgia for the past. And I think in the 80s, the 60s were about 20 years in the past. I think in the 90s, you saw that with sort of a nostalgia for the 70s disco era. And the 80s, I think the Reagan years were quite conforming with sort of the yuppie aesthetic. And I think for people who didn't quite fit the mold, the 60s was kind of romanticized a bit as a time of harmony and love and all that stuff. This and the summer of love. So that was very attractive to me. Okay, what is this? This is a Holy Virgin Cathedral in San Francisco on Geary Street. Now, what does that have to do with the two previous pictures? Okay, well, again, for people that aren't familiar with San Francisco, Geary Street is a very long boulevard. It runs east to west or vice versa, west to east, um, sort of from downtown to the Pacific Ocean. So where I lived in the Castro district is, boy, it's south of Geary, and I hope I'm saying this right. And the Haight-Ashbury is sort of west and north. So what I would do, well, first of all, why why I put this picture here. So when I lived in the Castro district, I was a student at UC Berkeley and I was studying art history. I had a particular interest. My interest kind of went all over the place. It was kind of strange. I lacked a lot of focus in every aspect of my life. I think it depended on the professor of the class. Like I would take a class on medieval art and I got really excited about that. And then I would take a class on French Impressionism and I got really enthused about that. So I kind of jumped around. But I did kind of settle a bit on medieval art, which is strange because I wasn't religious. I had been raised Catholic, but had had bad, wasn't interested in Catholicism as a religion at all. But the art of that period, I mean, I think Christian art in general, interested me. It's interesting though because, I mean, at Berkeley, but I think in general, a lot of times in certain sort of schools of art history, I think the art tends to be a bit separated from the culture it was created in. So it wasn't necessarily that I was looking at religious art, that I was necessarily religious or interested in their religion. So, gosh, I'm losing my train of thought. But so I was studying art history, and there's a museum in San Francisco, the Legion of Honor. So there's two large museums. There's the De Young and there's the Legion of Honor in San Francisco. The De Young primarily houses American art. I think some pre-Columbian and indigenous American art. I haven't been there in a long time, but and more contemporary. The Legion of Honor is European art. So I used to go to the Legion of Honor a lot, just for the general like holdings to see those artworks, but also when they had exhibitions. And the way I would travel is, let's see, from the Castro, I'd get on Divisadero, head head north, and then usually I would turn left on Geary, I think. But regardless, whenever was going to the Legion of Honor, I would pass this structure, this building. And I was kind of like, oh, okay, it's got. I mean, I looked at it out of the corner of my eye. I didn't really study it, and I was like, oh, onion domes. And I don't mean to be offensive to anybody, but just kind of just shows you where my head was. I was kind of like, oh, it must be like a mosque because I saw those onion domes. They look Islamic or Middle Eastern, and I was kind of like, okay, moving on. And I would pass it many, many, many times. Never thought much about it or what it was or anything. Let's see what the next. This is the interior of Holy Virgin Cathedral there in San Francisco. Very, very beautiful. There, I remember there was an exhibition of Byzantine iconography icons at the Legion of Honor, and I wish I could remember the year. And I've actually tried to look back and do some research on that. I can't find it. I believe it was in the 1990s, and I went to that and I was very impressed. I had already been familiar with icons in my at Berkeley. There weren't I thinking back, there weren't that many professors interested in Byzantine art. There were a number that were interested in the Middle Ages in the West. So I can't remember if I actually ever took a class on Byzantine art. I don't think I ever did. I think it would be mentioned in terms of the development of iconography in the West, but specifically, I don't think there was. But I certainly studied it and read about it. So I'd gone to this exhibition at the Legion of Honor, and I was talking to a friend of mine at Berkeley, and he had mentioned this church on Geary Street because I had told him how the icons were so beautiful. And the part of the exhibition that was very important, not important, but was sort of crucial to the experience was that the way that the it was designed, it was the icons weren't just displayed in a big room or gallery with white walls. They were designed and placed within the exhibition in very subdued lighting. It was that what they were trying to do, what the curators were trying to do, was sort of recreate in a very interesting way the way you would experience an icon within a church within their original setting. And I think it was very effective because it moved me very, very much. So I was talking to this friend of mine about all of that. And he said, well, you need to go to this Orthodox church on Geary Street. And I was like, oh, there's an Orthodox church on Geary Street. And he was explaining to me, I was like, oh, I know, I've driven by that. I was like, oh, okay. So I went and I was very, very moved again just by the space. And I wasn't converted by any means. I didn't know anything about the religion or anything, but I loved the artwork. And so it would be, I would say it'd be a few more years after that that I can't get my timeline exactly straight. Robin Williams said something interesting about the 1960s. He said, "Well, if you remember the 1960s, you weren't really there." And it was kind of like the 90s or that way for me because I was doing a lot of drugs. If you remember the 90s, you weren't really there. So I don't remember a lot of what happened. Big moments like this, I do recall. Let's see. So this is St. John Maximovich. So he is actually entombed, I guess that you would call it, or his relics, his intact body is there in the cathedral. I don't recall in the 90s if he had been exhumed at that point. I don't think he had, but he was the one that was really fundamental in terms of getting the cathedral built and having it completed. Now, in the 1960s, so this is all sort of coming together. Part of that is that I had heard now during this time when when I had first visited the cathedral, I didn't know about St. John Maximovich or the history of it. But I remember somebody saying or telling the story about an Orthodox monk who had once been a gay man in San Francisco. And I was like, oh, that's pretty interesting. And I never thought much about it again, but I'd heard this story. And then in 1999, I had a conversion. It was, and I've said it wasn't like St. Augustine, or for 10 years, like through the 1990s, I had been wrestling with sort of great, philosophical or theological questions. It was very much just like St. Paul. I was hit in the forehead with a thunderbolt. And after that, everything in my life had changed. Again, my memory is a little unreliable here, but I there was kind of a point where I did kind of ponder about which direction I was going to go into. I don't think I articulated it in terms of like, oh, am I going to be Orthodox or am I going to be Rome or go back to the Roman Catholic Church that I was raised in? I think I never really questioned so much that I was going to go back to Roman Catholicism because it was all I knew. But I did have an interest in Orthodoxy at that time, but I sort of disregarded it as being too unfamiliar. Because I think, especially in times of crisis, I think even if something had been negative or even traumatic, I think a lot of times we just naturally, human, in terms of like human re emotions, we go back to what is familiar. And I went back to the Catholic Church, but I always maintained this very strong Orthodox aesthetic. I had icons everywhere. It's very strange. And I continued to go to the Orthodox Church, not as a catechumen, certainly not, but and not even as an inquirer, but just as an observer. It's very interesting. But my father was raised in Sicily as a Byzantine Catholic, as a Uniate. So looking back at my childhood, we always had icons in the house, which is very interesting. And you see that in some Italian families, specifically with the icon of Our Lady of Perpetual Help, which has Byzantine origins. And it's interesting because when I went to Rome for the first time, I was like, and I wasn't Orthodox at this time. I was like, specifically, I want to see the original Our Lady of Perpetual Help, and it was I think it was a Passionist. It was a chapel. It was very small. It was kind of out of the way. No tourists. I think when I went to the chapel, there was maybe one other person there, and you see the uh, the icon. So throughout my time as a Roman Catholic for 20 years, because I came back to the church in 1999 and I left in 2018, so about 20 years. I had heard about this Orthodox monk who had been gay in the 1960s in San Francisco, Father Seraphim Rose. This is a really interesting picture of him. This is before his conversion. So Father Seraphim Rose was born in San Diego, California in 1934. So he's a native born Californian, which was important to me because I am too. So in 1934, he was born in the midst of the Great Depression. That was Bonnie and Clyde, um, the Great Dust Bowl in the Midwest, the rise of Hitler in Nazi Germany, in Germany, it wasn't Nazi Germany yet. So he was born in the Great Depression. He was not a boomer, but the generation before that, which has been called the silent generation. So he would have came of age in the 1950s. So what do I say about him? His This is where saints resonate through the centuries because here I am, I'm a Roman Catholic, although growing increasingly, I don't want to say disenchanted because I was never enchanted by the Catholic Church, but growing increasingly disappointed, I would say, and frustrated in Roman Catholicism. And I was really looking for guidance. And I kept remembering these stories about an Orthodox monk who had been a gay man in the 1960s in San Francisco, had left and founded this monastery in Northern California. It was kind of like an urban legend in San Francisco. So, I started doing just some random Google searches, and Father Seraphim Rose, his name came up. And I tend to, like I said, even when I was in college, I'd get very excited about a certain topic and become very enthused. And I did. I bought everything, every book that I could find on Father Seraphim Rose, and started reading the Damascene book. Of course, was one of them. I did buy this book. I know it's out of print um, right now, quite authoritative on the life of Father Seraphim Rose. It also does an excellent job of describing the historical circumstances of his life, in which he was born in California, the people that he encountered during his college years in Pomona, at Claremont College, and in San Francisco. So it's not only a biography of Father Seraphim, it's also, I think, a really good historical um, uh, uh, a book study about the time. Well, what disappointed me about the book was it didn't mention at all his, I don't know how to describe it, his personal life. So that was a disappointment. But, but I think what I did, garner from the book was just a very, I think, comprehensive history of Father Seraphim's life. And it certainly did do a very good job of explaining, the different paths his life took. So like I said, he was born in 1934 in San Diego, of three children, the youngest of three children, middle class, working class family, not particularly religious, I would say. He had as a lot of young men who later identify as gay. I think he had a complicated, somewhat intense relationship with his mother, and a distant, albeit in his case, not abusive relationship with his father, but I would say distant, I think is good, and certainly not as close as with his mother. In 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 many ways, I think his life does mirror what a lot of men who identify as gay go through. I think he in the book didn't look that closely into his high school life, but it's certainly in college, and he had friendships with women, but they seem to never be romantic, which I think is also indicative. He was always searching, I think, for something. I think as we all are, but as someone very intelligent, his quest was very much focused on the intellectual and also the spiritual. So he became very much enamored with these, I don't want to say gurus, but these spiritual teachers, because the 1950s are often, I think, misinterpreted as a very sort of complacent time. It was certainly a prosperous era in American history, but and I wrote about this ad nauseum in my book. There was a very rebellious attitude of the 1950s, and I think that's epitomized in James Dean in the movie Rebel Without a Cause, which had a big influence on me. There was this discontent in the 1950s with the growing sort of adulation of materialism, Everything was bigger in the car and bigger in the 50s. Houses were bigger, cars were bigger, everything was bigger. Movie stars were bigger. And there was a counter reaction to that. And I think it was very much symbolized in the beatniks of, Greenwich Village in New York City and in North Beach in San Francisco, where Father Seraphim Rose would end up. And the group that I could relate to his story so intensely and so intimately because it was kind of like reading his life story. And this is the power of great saints. It was like I was reading my own in very many ways. So he was with a group of friends in college who very much were um, very academically centered and were exploring sort of alternative, not realities. That would be the 60s uh, with psychedelics, but exploring sort of alternative views a lot. And he was a part of that group. And then in the book, I mean, they get a lot into Alan Watts, who was kind of like a pseudo pre-Timothy Leary, very much an exponent of, Eastern philosophy and Eastern mysticism. And I don't mean Eastern Orthodox, I mean uh, Asian, Buddhists and uh, religious ideas. And this appealed to Father Seraphim, the young Father Seraphim. So he sort of fought, so Alan Watts had gone up to San Francisco to start this very experimental college of Asian studies. So even I talked about the Castro in San Francisco having this um, very counterculture reputation. So even in the 1950s, this is very much solidified. Father Seraphim is up in San Francisco in the North Beach where the beatniks are and the beat poets like Jack Kerouac and all those guys. And so that social milieu is going. And then you have Berkeley on the other side of the bay, which is already it's more conservative than it is now. My gosh, I mean, when I was there in the 90s, it was crazy. But it didn't, it certainly had a more well, then you had the free speech movement, which started in the late 50s there. So it already had that sort of reputation, and and then just San Francisco in general. So Father Seraphim Rose is there during this very pivotal time in the 50s and the 60s. And well, this is I wish this wasn't such a controversial aspect of his life, but it has become, and it's unnecessary, I think, because in the Catholic Church there were so many things that were kept hidden, and I don't think that's ever a good idea. I think the truth needs to be told, whatever it is. And I think the truth of Father Seraphim Rose's life is what it is. And I think it's so much more powerful than an abridged version. And so during my studies, Father Seraphim, this is an interesting book, Orthodoxy and the Religion of the Future, because I mean, here, this is, of course, written after Father had his conversion and was an Orthodox monk. But here, you certainly see the influence of that 1950s, 1960s um, counterculture movement in San Francisco that he was either a part of or certainly a keen observer of, because he has a very in-depth knowledge of cults, strange mystical phenomena that I think was just coming into the public consciousness in the 1970s, especially in the wake of uh, the fascination with UFOs and then the rise of death cults like Jonestown. So, I mean, Father's experiences in San Francisco are certainly reflected in this book, and I would recommend it. But during my research of Father Seraphim, I came across this book, Seraphim Rose, The True Story and Private Letters by Kathy Scott. This was written by his niece. This is also out of print, and I wanted to read this one letter to you. So this is from 1956. So, and forgive me if I get Father's timeline muddled, but I'm doing my best. So his parents are still living in Southern California. I'm not sure if they had moved. I don't think they had. At one point, they moved from San Diego to Monterey, which is only about, oh, I don't know back then how long it took you to drive. It was about a 3 hour drive from, oh, no, no, no. It's probably maybe a 2 hour drive from San Francisco to Carmel, Monterey. But I think at this time they were still living in San Diego. So I think he was taking either a bus or a train. I'm pretty sure it was a bus to go visit his parents from San Francisco in San Diego. And during uh, the years that he was in San Francisco, he had met another gay man, and they had began a relationship. And it's interesting because actually through this guy, through his boyfriend, he was introduced through Orthodoxy because this man was Orthodox. So he's writing to a friend of his in 1956, and he wrote, "My mother has discovered, rather illegitimately, I shall tell you of it later, that I am a homosexual. If you have not surmised the fact already, it is time you know of it. I have not quite been kicked out of the house, but I probably shall not return after September. My mother was quite hysterical, but my father persuaded her that I am only sick. I have agreed to go to my friend's psychiatrist in San Francisco. That was his boyfriend's psychiatrist, which I was rather interested in doing for other reasons at parental expense. Father is so funny. I suppose you have also surmised by now that I shall live this summer and sleep with a young man I love and who loves me. I've been very stupid in Claremont. I've hardly been a friend to you. Forgive me. I was perhaps, it was perhaps not Claremont of which I was sick, but myself. I suppose I have not told you earlier of myself because I feared you would regard me a bug, a monster, or merely sick as my parents regard me. I am certainly sick, as all men are sick, who are even absent from the love of God. But I regard my sexual inclinations as perfectly normal. In a sense, I do not, as yet, understand. So now that I read this letter, I think Father at that time was splitting um, sort of his life between living with his parents, and he was working sort of part-time up in San Francisco. So this sort of was the impetus for him just making the move and leaving. And I think where Father references my mother has discovered rather illegitimately that I'm a homosexual, I think what had happened is that his mother was going through. But see, this is the father. This is the mother son relationship that happens in a lot of these situations. She was going through some papers or letters in his room and came across a letter from his boyfriend to him. And I think it was became clear that that's what was going on. Now, this letter from 1956 has been somewhat controversial. I've even seen on Orthodox, you know, Twitter space or whatever you want to call it, or Reddit or whatever discussion groups, that this is not true. That I don't know how they explain it away, but they just say it's not true, which I don't know why, because Father emerges so much more heroic and victorious over his past life with this included into the whole context. So I want to flip to um, something that's in the Damascene book. So the author, Hermonk Damascene, um, quotes in another letter, also written while drunk, he admitted, "I'm certainly sick, as all men are sick who are absent from the love of God." Footnote 12, page 58. Okay, where did we hear that? In another letter, also written drunk, he admitted, "I'm certainly sick, as all men are sick who are absent from the love of God." Okay, let's flip to the Kathy Scott book. In the Kathy Scott book, I am certainly sick, as all men are sick who are ever absent from the love of God. Same letter. Okay. So the letter that is reprinted in its entirety in this book, there it's referenced in this book. That was actually discovered by a friend of mine. I'll give credit to him. The reason I mention that is just that people are inevitably going to say that Father Seraphim, this was never part of Father Seraphim's life, but it clearly was. And I don't know why they deny it, because it's just like a huge missing chapter from his life. Here's Father. It's like great, great, great picture. So he overcame that. He overcame it. All of it. All that restless searching. And I think that aspect of his life resonates with so many people, especially nowadays, that restlessness. And he transcends orthodoxy. And what I mean by that, and I've said that before, there's no one in orthodoxy that I think raises the profile outside of orthodoxy like Father Seraphim Rose. I mean, for example, I had heard of him and I was not Orthodox. And there are many people that have heard of him and even read his books that are not Orthodox or not even interested in Orthodoxy. The only person I could think of that would come close to that is maybe Saint Seraphim of Sarov, who a lot of people have heard of. But Father Seraphim is an important figure, not even in Orthodoxy, but just in, I think, religious history and in the history of the United States. And I think that has to do with his writings, but I also think it has to do with the um, the story of his life. And it's, I've kind of had, I don't have conversations with saints, but I've thought a lot about Father, and I've wondered a lot of things. And I said, why, Father Seraphim, why didn't you make this known about your life, what you were able to overcome? But he was a humble man, and he was smarter than that because he went to the root cause. of a lot of these social ills, whether they're um, cults or the New Age or drug addiction or sexual promiscuity, or hopelessness or depression. He went to the cause of all of these things and he talked about that, which is this, deep well of despair in the soul of Western man. And that's how he talked about it. And his experience is what gave him that insight. And without it, I don't think he would have been able to reach out from the past and take hold of so many souls as he's done. And he certainly brought me to Orthodoxy. Ultimately, he did it, and I thank him. Okay, moving on. What the heck is this? This is a scene from the 1956 movie Anastasia, starring Ingrid Bergman, one of my favorite actresses, and Yul Brynner, also one of my favorite actors. What the heck does this have to do with saints? Well, I knew nothing, very little about Russian history, specifically the Russian royal family, except through my viewing of this movie. I mean, you see this in the Damn Machine book. Where is it? Um, with Father's as Father's life in San Francisco is retold. He was he lived a life of an urban gay guy. Very much, you see that in the letters. Very much interested in going out. I don't think he was a partier, um, but he certainly ate out a lot. That was important to him. He liked to experience different foods, different wines. He went to the movies a lot. It's funny. He mentions in one letter the Yul Brynner version of the Brothers Karamazov in one letter, and Father liked to go to theater, so he was very much in that scene, and I was too. So in the Castor, you had the Castor Theater, and I saw a lot of old movies. Anastasia was one of them. What gripped me about the movie, not the particulars, because it's a strange movie. It's sort of inspired by the life of Anna Anderson, who was this mentally ill woman who believed that she was the Grand Duchess Anastasia, the youngest daughter of Tsar Nicholas II. So it's a movie inspired by a story that is a false story. So it's sort of like a false story upon a false story. It's sort of like imagination on top of imagination. So it's this disassociation from reality in the movie where you have this very sick woman played by Ingrid Bergman who is wandering the streets, sort of like a bag lady, and trying to commit suicide. And she bears a resemblance, I guess, to what Anastasia would have looked like or what they would have thought she would have looked like in the film. The film is a hallucination. It's not real. And you have this man, this ex-Russian nobleman, aristocrat, I guess you'd call him, who is at a loose end, who a lot after the war, after the Russian Revolution, a lot of the formerly wealthy um, aristocrats and nobility had fled, and a lot of them ended up in Paris and France during the 1920s. So he's poor, and he's a grifter. He's looking for a scheme, and he wants to present to the Empress, who's the only really surviving, is one of the few only surviving Romanovs. Um, this woman as her granddaughter, and he uh, guides her, really sort of brainwashes her into taking on this role. And it resonated with me um, in terms of how people react to abuse, because this woman had been abused. She showed signs of physical abuse and how people disassociate and enter into a sort of fantasy world that isn't real. And I did that. Um, Homosexuality very much to me was an escape from what had happened to me as a child. So the movie today it resonates with me very strongly. So this is really all I knew about that period. And here's the actual Anastasia. So this is a portrait of course, Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, his four daughters. I'll give you an easy way to remember their name is um, think of Otma, Otma. So we've got Olga, we have Tatiana, we have Maria, and we have Anastasia, and then of course Alexei, the only son, and he was a hemophiliac. It's a very, very tragic story there. I'm not going to get in depth into that. Okay, so in 2018, well, 2017 was a bad year. 2017, I lost everything in a fire here in California and the terrible wildfires. My dad passed away soon after that. I literally walked away with just the clothes on my back, and that was it. So in 2018, I found myself renting a little house. And looking back, I just kind of didn't leave it for a year. I was in deep trauma. And not only because of what had happened recently, but because of just a lot of unresolved issues from my childhood and my past, um, dealing with the Catholic Church. So I just unplugged. It was bad. I didn't unplug from social media. I unplugged from the world, which, as a monastic, it sounds good, but uh, if you're in a bad place and you isolate yourself, you're going to go crazy. If you're not physically, mentally, and spiritually healthy, isolation is not good. It's not good. If you are able to do that, it can be an incredible way to grow in your relationship with God. But if you're not, forget it. The devil is behind every corner. So that was 2018. 2018 was also a bad year. It was the McCarrick scandal with the Vigano letter. I was trying to hold on to Catholicism very stubbornly. And although I had pretty much decided to leave, it was an agonizing decision. It was like getting a divorce. It was horrible. I didn't know what I was going to do. Um, and then in early 2019, I had made the decision to leave the Catholic Church. And then in 2019, two very good friends died unexpectedly, and I pushed me over the edge, and I had a nervous breakdown. I just took to the bed, took just the world became smaller. It became a house, and then it became a room. And I had a laptop, and I don't know what the hell I did. I think I watched the movie Anastasia with Ingrid Bergman, because she sort of, I don't know, she kind of encapsulated everything I was going through. And it's interesting on YouTube, you kind of sometimes go down this rabbit hole. It's like one video, you'll be watching one video and you'll have a recommendation. There'll be like a list or a stream of other videos related to that on the side. And I saw something about the Romanovs, the family. And I think I think it was Helen Rappaport And some people would disparage these sort of books as sort of like popular history. This is the Romanov sisters, the lost lives of the daughters of Nicholas and Alexandra. It's a wonderful book. It's a great place to start. It's easy and it's accessible, and you don't need to know anything about Russian history. So that's kind of where I started. And I became so intrigued with the lives of these people. Not not their very public lives as the royal family of Russia before um, the revolution in 1917, but the after part. You know, you had the two Russian revolutions. You had the February, which was sort of the popular revolution, which Nicholas abdicated, and then you have the October, which is when the Bolsheviks took over. So the family was deposed and arrested and imprisoned initially within one of the palaces in St. Petersburg. I can't remember which one. But then they were sent to Siberia. They were incredibly resolute, incredibly strong, courageous, and humble and compassionate. The way that they endured suffering was incredible. And it gave me so much hope. And at this point, I had just started going to the cathedral in San Francisco in 2019, and then COVID hits. What I tended to do is it's a big space, no pews. There's a few, benches against the back in the back. And I don't sit down. Those are kind of reserved for people that need to sit down during a long service because Orthodox services are long, liturgies are long. But I tended to hang back and just, watch. That's what I do. And it was foreign, but it was edifying in a way that I couldn't explain. I began, and there's an icon of the family in it's right near the shrine of St. John Maximovich, and I began to pray for their intercession because I was so physically ill, incredibly, and it worked. Um, I mean, mentally and physically, I was healed. This is the family I think it's in Tobolsk, which is the town in Siberia. They're all here except Alexandra, who was quite ill. They were just such wonderful, wonderful people. Um, I have a quote. This is from so the family was moved when the Bolsheviks took over. They were moved from Tobolsk to Ekaterinburg, which was still in Siberia, but moving moving west. And this is yeah, from house arrest in Tobolsk. Oh no, this is in Tobolsk, not in Ekaterinburg. In 1918, Grand Duchess Olga, the oldest, the daughter of the Tsar, passed along these words of her father. This was in a letter, so the only form of communication that the family had with people outside was through letters, and many of them have survived. Father asks to have it passed on to all who have remained loyal to him and to those on whom they might have influence, that they not avenge him. He has forgiven and prays for everyone, and not to avenge themselves, but to remember that the evil which is now in the world will become yet more powerful, and that it is not evil which conquers evil, but only love. Yeah, tough. This is the room in Ekaterinburg that they were all martyred. They weren't murdered, they were assassinated. And here, This is a beautiful, beautiful mosaic icon. So again, I think this demonstrates that great saints can reach through the ages to someone who absolutely here, I mean, here they died in 1918 in Russia, and I'm living a century later in the United States. I don't have a drop of Russian blood in me, and I'm not Orthodox, but their prayers were able to work wonders. That's amazing to me. Another great book before I leave the Romanovs. The Romanovs, Real Martyrs, What Silence Could Not Conceal. Okay, this brings me to the last saints, the Optina martyrs. This is Optina Monastery in Russia. Don't ask me to give you a big history of it because I don't know it. It is one of, I can tell you, it is one of the oldest, probably the most famous monastery in uh, Russia. Great saints have come out of that monastery. As an example, this is a wonderful book here. Living Without Hypocrisy, Spiritual Counsels of the Holy Elders of Optina. It's not a big book. Yeah, it's a wonderful book. Holy Trinity Publications in Jordanville. Just wonderful sayings and quotes from the many, many Saint Nectari, Saint Anthony, Saint Macarius. It just goes on and on and on and on. Saint Ambrose, Saint Nicone, Saint Joseph, Saint Anatoly, Saint Barsanophus. Wonderful, wonderful book. Okay, these are the three martyrs. So let me check my notes real quick. The new martyrs of Optina Monastery, April 18th, 1993. They were Hermonk Basil, he's in the middle right here. Monk Trophim, sorry, and Monk Therapoint. That's him right there. Uh, so the story, let's see, I did read this book maybe a year or two ago. It's called At the Ringing of the Bells, The Paschal Martyrs of Optina. And now Larson Books. Great book. Why I picked it up, I don't know. So in 1993, these were three ordinary monks at Optina. I mean, as ordinary as these men can be, they dedicate their life to God. They all three had very rich and full lives, before they entered. But of course, like Father Seraphim Rose, they, wanted a deeper, more profound relationship with God. And the monastic route is the way that they saw that, the vehicle in which they saw that happening. So they were at Optina, and I don't know the particulars because I haven't read the book in a while, but a crazed, satanic, psychopathic, demonically possessed murderer entered the monastery and killed them, all three of them. Anyway, here, I think that's Father Basil there. Um, it's Father Basil again, as far as I can tell. That is Monk. Sorry about that. That is Monk Trefum. They were bell ringers, which is interesting because, I mean, in Catholicism, I mean, bells are rung, certainly not much anymore. But in Europe, if they'll ring the cathedral bells or the church bells, and they're just sort of rung, but in just get a bonging sound. But in Orthodoxy, I found out that there's actually an art to it. It's a musical composition, and you need somebody that knows how to do that. And, it's it's a talent, and these two monks, Trophimus and Theropon, did that. Here's their graves. Let's go back to, yeah, this one where all three. Okay, so I'm not a dreamer. I'm not like Joseph, my namesake in the Old Testament. I don't dream. My dreams are, if I do dream, they're very mundane and forgettable. When I typically remember a dream, it's about food or something, eating a particularly good meal, something that I don't usually eat, some kind of pastry or something. So recently, I've been having a hard time with the abuse that I experienced in the Catholic Church as a child has haunted me for my whole life. And it's caused a lot of anger, a lot of resentment, a lot of bitterness, a lot of desire for revenge, a lot of desire for justice, which isn't a bad thing. Because if survivors hadn't come forward, none of this would have ever been known. And people, I mean, I think children and vulnerable people are still being abused in the Catholic Church, but I think it's certainly under more of a microscope than it used to be. And I don't think they can get away with it as easily as they did. But it's been a burden to me. And I've wanted some relief, and I just haven't been able to get it. So I had a dream. And let me just tell you the dream real quick. I was a boy again, about the age that I was abused. And I was in a surplice and cassock, which is like a pre-surplice. It's like a big black robe, long sleeve, down your feet, button up. And a surplice is a white, I don't know what you call it, draped, that's half length below your waist, long sleeve, that altar servers used to use. I don't think they use them much anymore. They use sort of an alb, but a robe. So I'm that boy again, and I'm processing, walking. It felt like a religious procession with a group of priests and other older men, and I can sense that I'm smaller and I'm shorter, and I'm scared. So we're walking, and we come up to another procession, another group of men, but they're all in black. And there's three figures, and I'm seeing all of this. I'm seeing their backs. I can't see their faces. And there's three at the end. And the one in the middle, this one, turns around, dead serious look on his face, turns around, like this, and looks, said, "You will not hurt the little one. You will not harm the little one." And that was it. And I woke up. I was like, wow, I'm okay. That was the end of the dream. Thanks. Thanks, Father. There they are. They've become icons. So, the moral of this story, saints that can reach out through time and change our lives. That is a powerful saint. And here's three that have done so. We have Father Seraphim Rose, the Royal Martyrs, and the three martyrs of Optina, who, even though I had read the book, I read it a couple of years ago, and I thought, interesting, very interesting. Hmm, I hadn't thought much about it since then. Wait, this is the kicker. This is the kicker. I almost forgot it. So I was telling this story to one of my friends on Facebook. I was saying, this is crazy. And he said, it happened on April 18th, the day they were martyred. I was like, you're right. Oh, man. I had no idea. I had no idea the date that they were martyred. Crazy. Crazy. So anyway, I encourage people to read these books. The Damascene book is very good. Um, this book is great. Also, a more popular history book on the Romanovs. Helen Rappaport has done several. And this one, all wonderful books during Lent. And I think these saints are a testament to the power of Orthodoxy to reach out to lives that never knew they existed. Here's a quote. It's my favorite quote from Father Seraphim Rose. Roman Catholics, in the midst of a disintegrating church structure, are finding that Orthodoxy is everything they once thought Roman Catholicism to be. Thank you, Father. Couldn't say it better. It's everything I thought Roman Catholicism to be and more. So these saints, I think, will continue to harvest souls and bring them to Orthodoxy. God bless you all and have a blessed Lent.